On the morning of March 24th, 1945, inside Broadcasting House on Portland Place in London, a BBC announcer leaned into his microphone and triggered a pre-recorded address. The voice belonged to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Winston Churchill was congratulating Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery on what he called the first assault crossing of the Rhine in modern history. There was one problem with the broadcast, a small, embarrassing, irretrievable problem. 36 hours earlier, an American general had already crossed the Rhine. He had crossed it at night. He had crossed it in wooden assault boats. He had crossed it without artillery preparation, without airborne support, without official permission, and without telling anyone outside his own command. His name was George Smith Patton, Jr. The broadcast played to the end. Nobody at the BBC stopped it. Nobody at Downing Street stopped it. And in 3 different headquarters that morning, London, Rhine, and Luxembourg City, 3 different men picked up 3 different telephones to ask the same question. How does the British Empire explain this? What Churchill would say in the hours and weeks that followed, first to his staff, then to Montgomery's headquarters, then in the closed pages of his own war memoir, would expose something the official communiques never could. The story of who really won the race to the Rhine. The story of how a farmer's army crossed the river the Wehrmacht had spent 5 years preparing to defend, and the story of one night in March 1945 when speed beat planning, audacity beat doctrine, and a single bridgehead bent the timeline of the Second World War. On March 16, 1945, along a 66-mile stretch of the Rhine's western bank, British and American smoke companies switched on their generators and began running them day and night. The screen would burn for the next 7 days, the longest sustained smoke deception in the history of warfare. Behind that chemical fog, an army was assembling. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was preparing the largest river crossing in Western military history. The numbers, even now, defy comfortable belief. 1,284,000 men assembled along the 21st Army Group front. 5,481 artillery pieces moved into camouflaged positions. 4,000 of those guns would fire continuously for 4 hours when the bombardment opened on the evening of March 23rd. 60,000 tons of fresh ammunition stockpiled for the British Second Army alone. 59,000 engineers, 37,000 British, 22,000 American, waiting to throw pontoon bridges across a river 300 meters wide. 2 complete airborne divisions, the British 6th and the U.S. 17th, preparing to drop on the East Bank at dawn on March 24th in Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne operation in human history. The U.S. 9th Army would issue over 800,000 maps. The 4th Canadian Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment, just one regiment among hundreds, would fire 13,896 rounds in the opening barrage alone. This was not a river crossing. This was a national statement. For weeks, Montgomery had drawn up the plan the same way he had won every major operation of his career, meticulously, exhaustively, and without compromise. El Alamein had been won that way. Normandy had been won that way. The Rhine, the last river barrier before Hitler's industrial heartland, would be won that way too, carefully, completely, and entirely on his terms. Winston Churchill agreed. The Prime Minister, who had defended Montgomery through every inter-service squabble of the war, had personally arranged to be at the front when the crossing began. He flew to Montgomery's tactical headquarters near Venlo on the eve of the operation. He had cleared his schedule for the entire week. He had pre-recorded for the BBC a victory address congratulating Montgomery on what he called the first assault crossing of the Rhine in modern history, ready to be broadcast the moment the bridgeheads were secured. Everything was prepared. The men, the guns, the engineers, the boats, the bombers, the paratroopers, the press, the Prime Minister himself, everything except one variable that nobody at 21st Army Group headquarters had factored into their calculations. Far to the south, in the operations room of the U.S. Third Army at Luxembourg City, an American general was studying a different stretch of the same river. He was not asking permission. He was not waiting for support. He was looking at his maps, looking at his calendar, and looking at the date Montgomery had chosen, and he was smiling.
On August 17, 1943, at 10:30 in the morning, George Patton drove into the bombed shell of Messina, wearing his polished helmet and cavalry riding boots. He had won. The 38-day Sicily campaign ended with the Americans entering the city hours before Montgomery's British 8th Army, exactly as Patton had told his subordinate, Major General Troy Middleton, in writing. "This is a horse race in which the prestige of the U.S. Army is at stake. We must take Messina before the British." It was the first time in the war that an American army had beaten a British army to a major prize. It was also the first time George Patton humiliated Bernard Montgomery on the front pages of every newspaper in the Western world. Montgomery never forgave him. 2 weeks earlier, on August 3rd, Patton had visited a field hospital and lost his temper. He slapped a soldier suffering from battle fatigue and called him a coward. On August 10th, he did it again to a second soldier in another hospital. When the news broke in the American press in November, the scandal nearly ended his career. Eisenhower considered relieving him. The War Department considered demoting him. Patton, who had just delivered the United States Army the largest amphibious victory in its history to date, was forced to apologize publicly to every unit in his command, hospital by hospital, formation by formation. He sat out D-Day in disgrace. He commanded a fictional army of inflatable tanks and dummy landing craft, while Bradley led the U.S. First Army across the Normandy beaches. Then, on April 25, 1944, 6 weeks before D-Day, Patton was invited to open a welcome club for American soldiers at the Ruskin Rooms in Knutsford, Cheshire. He had agreed not to give a speech. On the dais, he was introduced as a speaker anyway. He stood up and he said, "It is the evident destiny of the British and Americans, and of course the Russians, to rule the world." The reporter taking notes left out the Russians. The story hit newspapers in Washington, London, and Moscow within 48 hours. The Soviet ambassador filed a formal complaint. Congressman Karl Mundt declared on the floor of the House that Patton had succeeded in slapping the face of every one of the United Nations except Great Britain. Secretary of War Henry Stimson publicly disavowed him. General Marshall sent Eisenhower a message on April 29th that effectively gave him permission to relieve Patton from command of the Third Army before it had even fought a battle. Eisenhower nearly did it, but before he made that call, he picked up a different telephone and spoke with the one man whose opinion outweighed the entire United States War Department combined. Patton recorded what happened next in his diary on May 1st, 1944, a page now preserved in the Library of Congress. He talked to the Prime Minister about the incident, Patton wrote, and Churchill told him that he could see nothing to it, as Patton had simply told the truth. 8 words. That was all Winston Churchill needed to save Patton's career. Why? On March 7, 1945, at 4 in the afternoon, an American sergeant named Alexander Drabik sprinted across a 1,056-foot railroad bridge in the small German town of Remagen. He was a former meat cutter from Holland, Ohio. He was also the first Allied soldier to set foot on the eastern bank of the Rhine since Napoleon Bonaparte in 1805. The Germans had wired the bridge with 6,200 pounds of explosives. They had pressed the detonators. Most of the charges had failed to fire. The world found out within hours. Time magazine called it a moment in history. Eisenhower's chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, called the bridge worth its weight in gold. Eisenhower himself sent the First Army a personal message. The whole Allied force is delighted to cheer the First Army, whose speed and boldness have won the race to establish the first bridgehead over the Rhine. In Berlin, Hitler stopped working. 3 days later, on March 10th, he appointed General Lieutenant Rudolf Hübner, head of a new institution called Fliegendes Sonderstandgericht West, the Flying Special Court-Martial West. Its only function was to find the German officers responsible for losing the Ludendorff Bridge. The court convicted 4 of them. Major Hans Scheller, the adjutant who had been sent at 1:30 in the morning of March 7th to take command of the bridge defenses, was executed in the village of Birnbach within days. 3 others followed him. Only Captain Willy Bratke survived, because the Americans had captured him before Hitler's court could reach him. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding all German forces in the West, called it the crime of Remagen. It broke the front along the Rhine, he wrote. South of the action, in Luxembourg City, George Patton read the dispatches. He recorded a single sentence in his memoir about that day. "We were quite happy over it, but just a little envious. envious. Not delighted, not satisfied. Envious. Because someone else had just done the thing Patton had spent the entire war waiting to do himself. Bradley sensed it immediately. He drove down to Patton's headquarters and gave him a 5-word order that would shape the next 2 weeks of the war. Take the Rhine on the run. Patton did not need it repeated. By March 10th, 3 days after Remagen, his 4th Armored Division had advanced 55 miles in 48 hours and reached the Rhine north of Koblenz. By March 13th, he had crossed the Moselle and pushed armor through the Hunsrück Mountains that Schaeff had declared impassable. By March 22nd, he had 8 Third Army divisions standing along the Rhine from Koblenz to Ludwigshafen, every one of them looking east, every one of them looking at a different German riverbank, every one of them waiting for the signal. The bridge at Remagen had collapsed 5 days earlier under the strain of its own salvation, taking 28 American engineers down with it. The First Army no longer had its prize, but Patton was about to take his. On the morning of March 19, 1945, 3 American generals walked into a building at Place de Metz in Luxembourg City. The 12th Army Group called it Eagle Tack. Omar Bradley had moved his headquarters into the Railway Directorate offices the previous September. On that Monday morning, the building hosted a meeting of the 3 men who commanded the largest American ground force assembled in the history of the United States: Bradley of the 12th Army Group, Courtney Hodges of the 1st Army, and George Patton of the 3rd. They had a problem. That morning, in Reims, Eisenhower had quietly authorized Field Marshal Montgomery to draw on 10 American divisions for the upcoming Operation Plunder. 10 of the divisions that Bradley, Hodges, and Patton had personally trained, armed, and led across France were about to be transferred to a British field marshal whose methods all 3 Americans privately considered slow, predictable, and excessively cautious. The official U.S. Army history, written years later, would describe the mood in the Luxembourg room in one sentence. The fear of Montgomery taking over the war, the historian wrote, hovered specter-like over the meeting. They were not insubordinate. They did not refuse the order. They did not appeal to Washington. What was a 12th Army Group commander supposed to do? What they did instead was simpler, smarter, and entirely inside the boundaries of their command authority. They agreed to win the war faster than Montgomery could finish planning his crossing. Bradley laid it out. The First Army could expand the Remagen bridgehead immediately. The Third Army could cross the Rhine anywhere south of Mainz whenever Patton thought he could pull it off. Once both American armies were on the east bank, they would link up in the Lahn River Valley and turn northeast, driving up the Frankfurt-Kassel corridor, putting the entire 12th Army Group, not Montgomery's 21st, in position to carry the war into the German heartland. Patton said yes before Bradley finished the sentence. He had been waiting his entire career for this room, this map, this moment. The Sicily race had been a rehearsal. The Knutsford incident had been a near-fatal interruption. The slapping scandal had cost him the chance at Normandy. The bulge had bought his reputation back at terrible cost. And now, with Montgomery scheduled to cross on the night of March 23rd in front of 1,500 war correspondents and a personally invited British Prime Minister, Patton finally had what he had spent 20 months chasing: permission to move without asking, without waiting, and without warning anyone north of his sector. He drove back to his own headquarters at the Pescatori Foundation that afternoon and called Major General Manton Eddy, his 12th Corps commander. Eddy was scheduled to push the 5th Infantry Division across the Rhine on the night of March 23rd, the same night as Montgomery. "Move it up by 24 hours, Patton told him. Eddy protested. He needed time. He needed bridging equipment forward. He needed coordinated artillery and air cover. He needed everything that a normal river crossing required. Patton answered him with a sentence that became the most quoted line of the entire campaign. "Every day we save means the saving of hundreds of American lives. We can take the Rhine on the run." The clock started ticking. The moon was wrong. On the evening of March 22, 1945, as the 11th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. 5th Division moved into position along the Rhine, a clear sky turned the river into a silver mirror, visible from miles inland. Major General S. Leroy Irwin, commanding the division, had begged Patton for more time. He needed bridging equipment forward. He needed coordinated artillery. He needed something, anything, to compensate for the fact that his soldiers were about to attempt a hasty river crossing in full moonlight on a clear night against an enemy bank that overlooked 10 miles of flat ground beyond. Patton's answer had not changed in 48 hours. Move. Colonel Paul Black, commanding the 11th Infantry, set the assault for 2,200 hours, 2 battalions in the lead, the 3rd Battalion at Nierstein, a mile downstream from Oppenheim, and the 1st Battalion at Oppenheim itself. 500 assault boats brought forward by the 204th Engineer Combat Battalion, 12 infantrymen and 3 engineers per boat. No artillery preparation, no aircraft, no motors. Just men with paddles and rifles crossing 800 feet of moonlit water in silence. Behind them, on the western heights, 13 artillery battalions stood loaded and ranged on the far bank, waiting only for the order to fire. The order never came. For the first time in any major American river crossing of the war, surprise was the only weapon. At 22:30 hours, half an hour behind schedule, the first boats of the 3rd Battalion pushed away from Nierstein. 8 men, a platoon leader, and First Lieutenant Irvin Jacobs of Company K rowed the lead boat across. They drew exactly 1 burst of German machine gun fire from the eastern bank. Then something extraordinary happened. 5 German soldiers walked down from the dike with their hands above their heads. By the time the boat had been unloaded, 2 more had appeared. 7 Germans, taken by surprise by an American army they did not believe was coming, paddled themselves back across the Rhine to American captivity without an escort. The 1st American Infantry Company was on the east bank in 8 minutes. The U.S. Army's official history would later record, with what may be the most understated sentence in its entire 7-volume European theater series, that the chances of repelling an American blow at Oppenheim, should it come right away, were pathetically meager. By midnight, all 3 battalions of the 11th Infantry stood on the east bank of the Rhine. By 01:30 on March 23rd, the count was in. 3 full battalions across, 6 miles of riverfront secured, 20 casualties total. The first hostile German artillery rounds began landing on Oppenheim around the same time. A smattering, maybe 50 shells before dawn. An ammunition truck burned. 2 men in a battalion command post were wounded. That was the German answer. By 0200, the 7th Engineer Combat Battalion was loading the 10th Infantry Regiment into a second wave. By dawn, the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion was driving stakes for a 366-meter floating pontoon bridge that would be completed in 18 hours. By the time the first German plane was scrambled at dawn to investigate reports of activity at Oppenheim, the Third Army had a full division across. Far to the north, at Wesel, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's artillery had not yet fired a single round. Early on the morning of March 23rd, in his command post at the Pescatori Foundation in Luxembourg City, George Patton picked up the telephone and called Omar Bradley. The phone rang in Bradley's office at Eagle Tack before 7 in the morning on March 23, 1945. The voice on the other end was Patton's, but the tone was unusual. Patton did not boast on phones. Patton did not whisper on phones. Patton, who in normal circumstances opened conversations with profanity and ended them with theatrical demands for additional fuel, was speaking very, very quietly. "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across." Bradley sat up. He had been Patton's commanding officer for 9 months. He had known Patton since their days at West Point, more than 30 years. He recognized the rhythm immediately, the careful flatness of a man delivering news that could not be exaggerated and did not need to be. "Well, I'll be damned," Bradley said. "You mean across the Rhine?" "Sure am," Patton replied. "I sneaked a division over last night, but there are so few enemy troops around there they don't know it yet. So don't make any announcement. We'll keep it a secret until we see how it goes." The conversation lasted under 2 minutes. It would be reproduced word for word in 3 separate memoirs: Patton's, Bradley's, and that of Hobart Gay, Patton's chief of staff. Every serious historian of the Western Front has quoted it since. But notice what Patton was asking for. He was not asking for reinforcements. He was not asking for air cover. He was not asking for fuel, for once. He was asking for silence. The tactical reason he gave Bradley was real and entirely sensible. The Third Army's bridgehead at Oppenheim was only 6 miles wide and 1 infantry division deep. German air reconnaissance had begun flying over the crossing sites at dawn. If the German High Command realized the size of the breach in their last natural defensive line, they would shift their few remaining mobile reserves south to seal it before Patton could get armor across. That was the reason Patton gave. It was not the only reason he had. In Reims that same morning, Eisenhower was writing Patton a letter that would arrive at Third Army headquarters within 24 hours. "You have made your army a fighting force that is not excelled in effectiveness by any other of equal size in the world," the Supreme Commander wrote. "And I am very proud of the fact that you, as one of the fighting commanders who has been with me from the beginning of the African campaign, have performed so brilliantly throughout." It was a warm letter, a grateful letter, a letter written by a man who already knew, before the world did, that George Patton had just changed the timing of every plan Schaeff had drawn up for the rest of the war. Patton would not read the letter until that evening. By then, he would have already picked up the telephone a second time. By 1800, on March 23, 1945, the western sky above the Rhine had turned orange. At Rees and Wesel, more than 100 miles north of where Patton's 5th Division had crossed the previous night, Field Marshal Montgomery's preparatory bombardment had begun. 4,000 Allied guns firing simultaneously for 4 uninterrupted hours. The flash was visible across the German plain. The thunder rolled west into Belgium. British and Canadian gunners would fire so many rounds that the barrels of their field pieces glowed red-hot in the darkening sky. This was the bombardment Churchill had flown in from London to witness. This was the operation he had personally championed for 2 months. This was the moment that, in his pre-recorded BBC address already queued up in a London broadcasting studio, the Prime Minister had described as the first assault crossing of the Rhine in modern history. At 2100 hours, the 7th Battalion of the Black Watch, Royal Highland Regiment, 51st Highland Division, pushed off from the western bank near Rees in armored buffalo amphibians. Operation Plunder had begun. In a sandbagged farmhouse near Venlo, Churchill watched. Montgomery watched beside him. The largest river crossing in Western military history was unfolding exactly on schedule, exactly to plan, exactly as the Prime Minister had been promised. In Berlin, in his underground command post, Hitler was on the telephone. He was not calling about Wesel. He was calling about Oppenheim. The American bridgehead that had not been on any German contingency map 24 hours earlier was now expanding rapidly across the central Rhine. Hitler ordered the immediate counterattack of all available mobile reserves on the southern front. The reply was direct. There were no available mobile reserves. There were no available motorized reserves. There were no available reserves of any kind on the central Rhine front. Hitler hung up. At his command post in the Pescatore Foundation, George Patton picked up the telephone. It was shortly before midnight on March 23rd. Operation Plunder had been underway for 3 hours. The Black Watch was on the eastern bank. Churchill was at Montgomery's headquarters watching the bombardment continue. War correspondents were standing by to file the morning's headlines. And in London, the BBC was preparing to broadcast the Prime Minister's pre-recorded victory address at first light. "Brad, for God's sake, tell the world we're across," Patton said. "I want the world to know Third Army made it before Monty starts across." Bradley did not need to be asked twice. He picked up his own telephone and called Schaeff Press Affairs in Rhine. The wire services received the bulletin within the hour. By 2 o'clock on March 24th, while Operation Plunder was still unfolding and Montgomery's lead divisions had not yet linked up on the East Bank, every newspaper editor in the English-speaking world had 2 stories on his desk, and one of them was 24 hours older than the other. The official U.S. Army history would describe the timing of Bradley's release with one understated phrase. It was, the historian wrote, calculated to take some of the luster from the news of Montgomery's crossing. The British Broadcasting Corporation had no idea what was about to happen at sunrise. At first light on March 24, 1945, a BBC duty announcer in Broadcasting House, London, sat down in front of a microphone, opened a script that had been delivered from Downing Street several days earlier, and pressed the cue for a pre-recorded gramophone disc. The voice that filled the airwaves of the British Empire was Winston Churchill's. The address was short. It congratulated the men of Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group on what the Prime Minister called the first assault crossing of the Rhine in modern history. It praised the British Army for its skill and its patience. It celebrated the moment as the moral consummation of 5 years of Anglo-Canadian sacrifice in Western Europe. It was an exquisitely written speech. It was also, by the time it played that morning, exactly 36 hours obsolete. George Patton's 5th Infantry Division had been on the east bank of the Rhine since 22:30 on the night of March 22nd. By the morning of March 24th, the Third Army had 3 full divisions across: the 5th Infantry, the 90th Infantry, and the 4th Armored, with the 87th Infantry preparing to cross at Beauport later that day. A 366-meter pontoon bridge built by the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion was carrying tanks east toward Frankfurt before British armor had even reached the eastern bank near Wesel. The Third Army's press release, transmitted by Schaeff the previous night, had been on the front page of every major American newspaper for almost 12 hours. In London, the duty staff at Broadcasting House realized the problem before the address even finished playing. There was no time to recall the speech. There was no time to issue a clarification. There was no time to do anything except let the recording finish. Patton would describe the moment in his memoir, War as I Knew It, in a voice barely able to contain its satisfaction. Mr. Churchill, Patton wrote a speech congratulating Montgomery on the first assault crossing over the Rhine in modern history. This speech was recorded and, through some error on the part of the British Broadcasting Company, was broadcast, in spite of the fact that the Third Army had been across for some 36 hours. The official U.S. Army history of the European theater recorded the same incident in a single, dry sentence. Some officers of the Third Army staff drew added delight from the fact that the British Broadcasting Corporation the next day played without change a pre-recorded speech by Prime Minister Churchill, praising the British for the first assault crossing of the Rhine in modern history. Some officers drew added delight. That was as close as the U.S. Army's official historians ever came to laughing on the record. In London, embarrassment hardened into silence. The BBC offered no public correction. The Prime Minister's office issued no clarification. The British government acted as if the broadcast had never happened. Meanwhile, on the eastern bank of the Rhine, more than 100 miles south of Wesel, George Patton was about to make sure the world remembered exactly whose army had gotten there first. On the morning of March 24th, 1945, while the Prime Minister's voice was still echoing across the BBC airwaves, George Patton drove down to the pontoon bridge at Nierstein in his open Jeep with 3 Army photographers and a war correspondent from the wire services. He had planned this for a long time. The bridge, the 366-meter pontoon span that the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion had finished the previous afternoon, was a Class 40 floating treadway capable of carrying medium tanks. By that morning, it had already been in continuous use for 16 hours. Sherman tanks of the 4th Armored Division were rolling across at 5-minute intervals, the engineer planking flexing under their weight, soldiers on both banks pausing to watch, as more vehicles than the German High Command had even known were on the Rhine front crossed openly in daylight. Patton walked out to the middle of the bridge. He stopped. He turned to the photographer. "I've been looking forward to this for a long time," he said. Then he stepped to the railing, and performed his long-promised gesture of defiance into the Rhine River. The photographer caught all of it. Patton himself would describe the moment in his memoir with the casual pride of a man who had finally settled an account that had been outstanding since 1918. He had told his staff months earlier that he intended to relieve himself in the Rhine when he reached it. He had now done so, in full uniform, in daylight, in front of cameras, in the middle of a working bridge full of American armor pushing into the heart of Germany. He was not finished. When he reached the eastern bank, Patton deliberately pretended to lose his footing on the muddy riverbank. He fell forward onto his hands. He stood up with a fistful of German soil in each hand, repeating the gesture William the Conqueror had performed on the beach at Pevensey in 1066, a piece of military theater 9 centuries old, staged by a 59-year-old American general on the muddy floodplain of the central Rhine. That evening, he sent a personal message to Dwight Eisenhower at Schaef in Rhine. The text read in full, "Dear Schaef, I have just relieved myself into the Rhine River. For God's sake, send some gasoline." The wire services picked it up. American newspapers printed sanitized versions. Time magazine framed the moment as the natural conclusion of the most audacious river crossing in modern military history. In London, Winston Churchill read all of it. He read the news of Patton's crossing. He read the BBC broadcast transcript. He read the wire reports of the urination. He read, in the original unsanitized form, the message to Eisenhower asking for gasoline. And then he picked up his pen. On the morning of March 24, 1945, while George Patton was making history on a pontoon bridge at Nierstein, Winston Churchill was making his own kind of history far to the north. The Prime Minister had been driving along the western bank of the Rhine with Lieutenant General William Hood Simpson of the U.S. Ninth Army when Simpson offered him an opportunity for a sanitary stop. Churchill refused. He had been told that the Siegfried line, Hitler's last great defensive belt of concrete tank obstacles, was 30 minutes ahead. He waited. When the convoy reached the Dragon's Teeth, the rows of pyramid-shaped anti-tank obstacles Hitler's engineers had spent years pouring across western Germany, Churchill ordered the cars stopped. He climbed out. He examined the concrete. He turned to the gentlemen of his retinue. "Gentlemen," the Prime Minister announced, "it's time to relieve ourselves." He walked over to Hitler's wall and left his own definitive mark on the Nazi defenses. Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, recorded the moment in his diary that evening. "I shall never forget," Brooke wrote, "the childish grin of intense satisfaction that spread all over his face as he looked down at the critical moment. A British Prime Minister leaving his mark on Hitler's wall, an American general doing the same into the Rhine. The same gesture, performed at the same hour, on the same day, by two men who understood each other better than either ever admitted out loud." Churchill, who would later forbid the publication of any photograph of the act, "This is one of the operations connected with this great war which must not be reproduced graphically," he wrote, did not return to London. He stayed at the front. The following morning, March 25th, he asked Eisenhower for permission to cross the Rhine into Germany itself. Eisenhower had anticipated this. Days earlier, the Supreme Allied Commander had issued explicit standing orders to every commander in the British and Canadian sectors. If the Prime Minister asks to cross the Rhine, the answer must be no. Eisenhower met him at Montgomery's headquarters that morning. Bradley met him there. Both Supreme Commanders made it politely, formally, and unmistakably clear that the Prime Minister was not to cross. Then Eisenhower and Bradley left to attend to their own commands. Churchill turned to Montgomery. "Why not?" he asked. Within the hour, the 70-year-old Prime Minister of the United Kingdom was aboard a Buffalo amphibian, churning across the Rhine into territory that had been German for 1,000 years. He spent approximately 30 minutes on the East Bank. He returned grinning. He never publicly criticized Patton for the BBC incident. He never reprimanded the man whose audacity had made his pre-recorded speech sound foolish. He never sent the cable demanding relief that British prestige would have expected. He let the embarrassment die quietly because he understood, as he had understood a year earlier when Eisenhower had nearly relieved Patton over the Knutsford speech, that Patton's sins were the sins of a man who told the truth too loudly and moved too fast for diplomacy to catch up. The only words Winston Churchill ever spoke about George Patton on the record were the 8 he had given Eisenhower in the summer of 1944. Patton had simply told the truth. He spoke them once. He never had to speak them again. The men who crossed at Nierstein that night did not know the war in Europe would end in 6 weeks. They did not know their commander would not see another new year. George Patton was taken by a routine traffic accident that December, buried at the American Military Cemetery in Ham, Luxembourg, 6 miles from the Pescatore Foundation, where he had picked up the telephone 2 days after the crossing and told the world to take notice. They were not strategists. They were not generals. They were not heroes by the standards they themselves would have used. They were men who figured out, on a cold March night in 1945, that speed beats planning, audacity beats doctrine, and the river you cross first is the one you get to name. If this story brought you something worth remembering, take a moment to like this video, Subscribe to stay with us as we keep uncovering the unwritten chapters of the Second World War. Thank you for watching.